Angela sat in the cold, sterile waiting room, her 2-year-old son, Malik, limp in her arms. His fever had been relentless for 2 days, and now his breathing was shallow. She had rushed to the emergency room, her heart pounding with fear. But now, 2 hours had passed, and no one had called their name. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, startling her. It was her sister, Renee. "Angela, did you get to the ER?" Renee's voice was steady but laced with concern. "Yes," Angela whispered, not wanting anyone to hear the tremble in her voice. "We've been waiting for 2 hours. Renee, they won't even look at him." Renee was silent for a moment, then her voice hardened. "Go to the desk again. Tell them you're not leaving until someone checks Malik. Don't let them brush you off." Angela hesitated. She wanted to follow Renee's advice, but she could still feel the nurse's piercing glare from earlier. What if she made it worse? What if speaking up made them delay even longer, just to teach her a lesson? She looked down at Malik, his eyelashes fluttering weakly against his cheeks. He needed her to fight for him. Taking a deep breath, Angela marched back to the desk. This time, her voice was louder, her presence firmer. "My son needs help now," she said, her tone unwavering. "He's barely breathing, and if you don't get someone out here in the next 5 minutes, I'm calling an ambulance to take him to another hospital." The nurse finally looked up, her expression flickering with irritation and, was that fear? Without a word, she grabbed a clipboard and disappeared through the double doors. Moments later, a young doctor rushed out, his brow furrowed with concern. "Let me see him," he said, gently lifting Malik from Angela's arms. His face grew serious as he checked Malik's pulse and listened to his breathing. "This is critical," the doctor muttered. "Why wasn't he brought in sooner?" Angela opened her mouth, ready to unleash the fury that had been building inside her, but the doctor had already turned to the nurse, his voice sharp. "We need a room now." For the first time that night, Angela felt a glimmer of relief as Malik was whisked away for treatment, but as she sat alone in the hospital hallway, the anger she had suppressed began to surface. This wasn't just about Malik, it was about every black mother, every family, who had been ignored, dismissed, or overlooked because of who they were. She thought of her neighbor, Patricia, who had lost her husband to a stroke after his symptoms were ignored, or the story of Keisha, a pregnant woman who had begged for help in labor, only to lose her baby because no one believed her when she said something was wrong. Angela's hands balled into fists. How many more lives had to be endangered before things changed? She glanced at the reception desk. The nurse, a middle-aged white woman with a tight smile, barely looked up when Angela had arrived, dismissing her urgency with a clipped, "Take a seat. We'll call you when we're ready." Angela had obeyed, holding her son close, silently pleading for him to stay strong. Nearby, a white mother entered with her son, who was clutching his wrist and wincing in pain. Within minutes, they were called back. Angela's stomach twisted. "Excuse me," she said, approaching the desk again. "My son is struggling to breathe. He needs help now." The nurse sighed, looking annoyed. "We triage based on severity. Take your seat." "But..." The nurse cut her off, her tone sharp, her gaze icy. "Do not make a scene." Angela froze, her cheeks burned, and her heart raced, not with fear for her son this time, but with anger. She returned to her chair, helpless, her mind racing. She thought of her mother's warnings. "Be careful, baby. They don't listen to us like they do others. Speak politely, but don't expect too much." Angela hadn't wanted to believe it, but now, here she was, trapped in a moment her mother had endured time and time again. Angela clenched her teeth, fighting back tears. Malik's tiny body shuddered in her arms as another weak cough escaped his lips. She tried to stay calm, but panic was bubbling beneath the surface. How much longer could he hold on like this? Angela sat by Malik's bedside, her hand gently stroking his tiny fingers. The oxygen mask on his face hissed softly as his chest rose and fell with newfound rhythm. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly overtaken by a simmering rage. Her son had come dangerously close to being another statistic, another name in the countless stories of neglect that she had heard but never thought would happen to her. Now, she realized that her fears weren't paranoia, they were reality. As she sat in silence, another voice in the room broke her thoughts. "You're lucky you spoke up when you did," the young doctor said, stepping into the room with a clipboard in hand. His face was kind but tired, as though he carried the weight of every patient he had ever treated. "Lucky?" Angela's voice was sharp, almost venomous. "My son could have died because your staff didn't take us seriously." The doctor sighed, setting the clipboard down on the counter. You're right, he admitted, his tone sincere. What happened tonight shouldn't have happened, but he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. This isn't the first time I've seen it, and it won't be the last. Angela's stomach twisted. What do you mean by that? The doctor ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. I've seen patients like Malik, patients like you, wait longer than they should. Sometimes it's unintentional bias, other times, it's systemic. Either way, it's wrong. Angela stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe he cared, but his words felt like an admission of guilt, not his, but the hospital's, the system's, the world's. Do you know how many times I've heard it's wrong? Angela snapped, her voice trembling. And yet, nothing changes, nothing ever changes. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, Malik's breathing steadied, and he drifted into a peaceful sleep. Angela couldn't sleep, though. Her mind raced with memories of other women who had shared their pain, their stories of neglect and suffering. She thought of Maria, her co-worker, who had once collapsed at work from severe stomach pain. Maria had gone to the emergency room, where the doctors dismissed her as probably overeating. Days later, she was rushed into emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix. Angela also remembered Patricia, her elderly neighbor, who had suffered a heart attack. Her complaints of chest pain had been ignored because the nurse thought Patricia was just anxious. She hadn't survived the night. The faces of these women burned in Angela's memory, their pain, their losses, and their voices echoed in her mind, growing louder until they drowned out every other thought. When the doctor returned to check on Malik, Angela's frustration boiled over. Do you know how many women like me have to beg to be heard? She demanded. Why is it that when we speak up, we're angry or hysterical? Why is our pain ignored until it's too late? The doctor met her gaze, his expression unreadable. I don't have an answer, he said quietly, but I know it's wrong, and I know it's not fair. Angela laughed bitterly. Fair? Do you think Patricia's death was fair? Or Maria's near death? Or my son almost being ignored until it was too late? Fair doesn't exist for us. Her words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. The doctor sighed deeply. I can't undo what's been done, he said, but I can do better. I can make sure no one in my care feels ignored. Angela wanted to believe him, but her trust in the system was shattered. Words meant nothing if the system stayed the same. Angela left the hospital with Malik cradled in her arms. The relief of his recovery was overshadowed by a burning resolve. As she strapped him into his car seat, she thought of every mother who didn't get to take their child home. It wasn't enough to be angry. She had to do something. A week later, Angela sat in her living room with her sister, Renee, scrolling through social media posts. Stories poured in, women sharing their experiences, their losses, their fights for accountability. Angela realized this wasn't just her battle, it was a war that had been fought for generations. We need to speak up, Renee said firmly, pointing at the screen. You should share your story, Angela. People need to know. Angela hesitated. And what good will that do? People share their pain all the time, and nothing changes. Not if we stay quiet, Renee replied. You can't wait for someone else to fix this. You have to be the one to start. Renee's words echoed in Angela's mind for days. Finally, one evening, she sat down and began typing. My name is Angela Harris, and last week, my son was almost a victim of medical neglect. She poured her heart into the post, describing every painful detail, the dismissive nurse, the hours of waiting, the fear of losing her son. But she didn't stop there. She called for accountability, demanding changes in emergency room protocols and urging others to share their stories. Angela hit post and braced herself for the backlash. She wasn't prepared for what came next. Within hours, the post went viral. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others dismissive, but most echoing her pain. Women shared their own harrowing experiences, each story more heartbreaking than the last. One comment stood out. Let's do something about this. Meet us at the community center Friday night. We're organizing. That Friday, Angela arrived at the center, unsure of what to expect. The room buzzed with energy. Dozens of women of all ages and backgrounds had gathered, their faces filled with determination. A woman named Letitia stood at the front, commanding the room with her presence. She was a lawyer who had lost her sister to medical neglect and had since dedicated her life to fighting for justice. Thank you for coming, Letitia began. We're here because the system has failed us time and time again. But tonight, we're taking the first step to change that. The group began brainstorming solutions, filing complaints, organizing protests. lobbying for policy changes. Angela sat quietly, absorbing it all. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, Angela threw herself into the movement. She helped organize rallies, where women held signs that read, "Our pain matters," and "No more silence." They marched to hospital administrators' offices, demanding accountability and transparency. Angela's voice grew stronger with every action. She spoke at town halls, sharing her story and urging others to fight back. "We're not just statistics," she said at one rally. "We're mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends, and we deserve to be heard." The movement gained traction, attracting media attention. News outlets began covering their protests, shining a light on the systemic racism in healthcare. Angela's face appeared on television screens, her words resonating with millions. But not everyone supported their cause. Critics accused them of overreacting, claiming that healthcare workers were doing their best. Angela received hate messages and threats, but she refused to back down. "This isn't just about me," she told Renee one night. "This is about all of us. If we don't fight, nothing will ever change." Months passed, and the movement Angela had joined grew beyond anything she could have imagined. Social media campaigns turned into petitions, petitions led to meetings with hospital boards, and the stories of neglect and discrimination became impossible for anyone to ignore. Angela found herself at the center of it all. She was no longer the frightened mother in the ER, she was a leader, a voice for countless women who had been silenced for too long. But with her newfound role came immense pressure. "Do you think this will actually work?" Angela asked Renee one evening as they prepared for another rally. Malik, now fully recovered, played with blocks on the floor nearby. "It already is," Renee said with a reassuring smile. "Look at how far you've come. You've made people listen, Angela. That's something they can't ignore." Angela nodded, though doubt still lingered in her heart. Change felt so slow, so fragile. But as she scrolled through messages from women thanking her for speaking out, she knew she couldn't stop now. The breakthrough came one morning when Angela received an email from Letitia. The subject line read, "We did it." Angela's hands trembled as she opened it. The email explained that a major hospital chain had announced a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training for staff, improved patient triage protocols, and the creation of a task force to address racial disparities in care. "They're actually listening," Angela whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Renee, sitting across the table, grinned. "This is just the beginning." The news spread quickly, igniting hope within the movement. Hospitals across the country began to follow suit, and policymakers started drafting legislation to hold medical institutions accountable. But for Angela, the victory was bittersweet. While she was proud of the progress, she couldn't forget the women who hadn't lived to see this moment. Patricia, Maria, so many others whose names would never be known. Months later, Angela stood on a stage in front of a crowd of thousands at a national conference on healthcare equity. She held the microphone tightly, her heart pounding as she looked out at the sea of faces. "When I walked into that emergency room with my son, I was just another black mother begging to be heard," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never imagined that moment of pain would lead to this." The crowd fell silent, hanging on her every word. "This isn't just my story. It's our story. It's the story of every woman who has ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated as less than human. And while we've made progress, our work isn't done. We owe it to the ones we've lost, and to the ones who will come after us, to keep fighting until the system changes for good." The room erupted into applause, but Angela barely heard it. Her mind was on Malik, sitting in the front row with Renee, waving at her with a big smile. He was her reason, her strength, her hope. As the conference ended, a young woman approached Angela, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Your story saved my son's life. I fought for him because of you." Angela hugged her tightly, realizing in that moment that her fight had been worth it. Change was slow, but it was real, and it had already begun. Walking out of the auditorium, Angela felt a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just resisting the system anymore, she was rebuilding it, brick by brick, for a future where every voice mattered, and every life was valued. The end.